Hello. It seems that we are continually doing this show these days. And today is a very interesting one because we're having the opportunity of talking to somebody who's doing really leading edge research in terms of the role of near-death experiences, the role of dimethyltryptamine and everything else. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our guest today, Pascal. And if Pascal, if you can just explain a little bit about how you've ended up doing what you're doing, really, because I know we've met on a few occasions, but I don't know your background and everything. So maybe for the watchers and the listeners, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, it's really cool to be here, and thank you, because yeah, like you say, we have met a couple of times, but before that, some years ago, I think the book's kind of somewhere just behind me. It was a kind of library guardian angel thing. I was at my grandparents' and this book just kind of jumped out, and it was your original one, I think. It's Their Life After Death. And it was, you know, those years ago, it really had that imprint on me, and it was really, really fascinating. And, you know, that was one of many of, you know, getting into this field by reading. My mum has always been extremely interested in all of this stuff. And it was really one of the key things in my mind, which also spurred me on in this kind of orientation. What made me go down this sort of parallel world was giving me books on near-death experiences. It was actually, the first one was Transformed by the Light by Melvin Morse. And that just continued. But I've always had this interest in these kinds of phenomena. I've always, not just in an intellectual way, but I think in an emotional way. I think I always felt being in a different place. You know, maybe it would be exaggerated to say being in an altered state, but I think I got into those states more readily, and so on a kind of more intuitive level, and you know, always projected me in these kind of directions to learn more about it and understand it. You know, writing a poem when I was 10 years old is also a really core thing in my memory, because now when I look at it, it was one of the first poems I ever wrote, and now when I look at it, it's exactly like a DMT trip or a near-death experience. It's uncanny, actually. So, you know, these sort of signs. And so I did neuroscience at Aberdeen University, and then really for similar reasons, you know, to understand about the spiritual sort of dimension to reality, if there is indeed one. But if there was one, it would have some inextricable relationship to the brain. And I was always fascinated by science, had an aptitude for science, so I wanted to frame my kind of budding ideas about you know, metaphysical realities or otherwise in a very solid scientific sort of basis. So and then, you know, I actually went to UCL and did some work in the psychiatry department, so did a master's there. But ultimately, it was these ontological questions which really interested me. So now doing a PhD with David Luke, I'm in my final year at Greenwich University, looking at DMT and near-death experiences.
I'm quite intrigued as to when you were doing your undergraduate courses, was there ever were you ever allowed to discuss the kind of things that we're discussing now? You know, was it fairly open in terms of that kind of environment of discussing the softer aspects of the human experience, as you said, the ontological aspects?
Yeah, I can't remember doing so with the staff, the lecturers per se. It was a really good medical science school, like really rigorous. They may well have been open to it, but maybe I assume they wouldn't be at that early stage. So but I did invite, well, I suggested to one of the lecturers when it came to writing my thesis that I wanted to do a full comprehensive review of the neuroscience of the near-death experience, thinking that I'd be kind of maybe shot down. But he was really, really open to it. In fact, he did a lot of work on the NMDA receptor during his career. And so he was very interested in my proposal that, well, my mentioning about Janssen's theory that ketamine, or endogenous like ketamine chemicals in the brain, is involved in near-death experience. And ketamine is an antagonist at the NMDA receptor. So he was like, you know, so he was open to that, to be honest. It was actually later, sorry, when I was at UCL, I suggested doing near-death experience research as well, and one of the relatively well-known clinical psychologists that really recommended against it.
That's interesting in itself, isn't it? But I suppose it's the difficulty of exactly where you want your career to go in your academic career. Just on that, as an opportunity, David and I, when we had the last show, when we had David Luke on, we touched upon the whole ketamine model and the work of Carl Janssen. He was at the Maudsley Hospital, as I recall. What's your thoughts on that? Because it's gone a little bit quiet. And I was in contact with him, I think about 8 or 9 years ago, and I was very intrigued by the model. What's the general opinion of it now?
Well, I think basically DMT and ketamine are the best candidates for if you really want to look for an endogenous neurotransmitter which has some major role to play. If you were to just look at the possible endogenous neurochemicals, I mean, with ketamine, if you're specifically asking, there's one recent paper that I absolutely loved. It was Marshall et al. 2019, and so they basically looked at Erowid, which is a website where they upload thousands upon thousands of different drug trips, and usually psychedelics, and they compared those to near-death experiences, hundreds of which given by Bruce Grayson, and they found, doing a semantic analysis of which drug reports basically correspond the best to near-death experience, that ketamine was the best. And then somewhat followed by salvia divinorum, which was an interesting kind of wild card, but there might be some reasons for that. And then basically followed by serotonergic psychedelics, DMT being one of them, but kind of on the same level as other serotonergic psychedelics, psilocybin and ayahuasca was sort of near there. So yeah, ketamine is a good candidate because it's certainly it's a dissociative, and the kind of near-death experience, especially the out-of-body component, is a kind of fundamental dissociative experience. And so the OBE and so the OBE and near-death experiences and that happening in ketamine experiences, because ketamine is the most reliable drug at doing that, that's one clear parallel. But yeah, the other phenomenological kind of similarities potentially are the deceased relatives aspects. There hasn't been enough rigorous research really climbing into the phenomenology of ketamine now, unfortunately. I'm doing that with DMT and comparing it to NDEs, but I think there was one, interestingly, just as one anecdote, there was Janssen did report in his 2001 book that of a individual who had both ketamine and near-death experiences, and in his ketamine experience he did mention that he felt the presence, basically encountered his deceased girlfriend or wife. So that was interesting, but then he may well have been primed for that because he took the ketamine soon after the death. But there are some phenomenological relationships with ketamine and near-death experience that DMT doesn't have, and the OBE is one of them, which DMT does not really produce. But neurochemically, there's no endopsychosins in the brain that have been identified definitively. There's just a host of candidates like agmatine or NAG, maybe even magnesium, because they also antagonize the same NMDA receptor. But yeah, I mean, there hasn't been definitive studies to see if any of those are upregulated at the point of death. Another thing I'd say, sorry if I'm rambling on, but I remember that in your talk with Dave Luke, you kind of mentioned that because you were interested in the glutamate increase at the point of death. And that's something we can get onto, which is really interesting, which is the release of these chemicals. The studies of the release of these chemicals actually have been done, albeit not in humans, in rats, and they found only a 3-fold increase in glutamate. And then, like Dave was saying, and it's very, very relevant for my research, all these other neurotransmitters, the major monoamines, even GABA, you know, were really massively, absurdly upregulated in sometimes, whereas glutamate was only about threefold over the course of a few minutes post cardiac arrest, which was strange because you do, you know, the release of glutamate, because the inhibitory neurons generally die, and then there's overexcitation, which is mediated by glutamate, and you think it would be more than that, but you know, what may well be due to that all these other neurochemicals are upregulated to kind of mitigate the negative effects of that in the same way that kind of Janssen was suggesting.
Do you know, there's a danger here that we're going to get incredibly technical, because there's a million and one questions I had from there, and I was thinking, no, I need to ask about the gene work and everything else. But I'm realizing, of course, that we have listeners out there as well who are keen on the more general case. So if we can go back a little bit, and we'll get into this in greater detail later, because I'm not losing that thread. I think it's incredibly important. But in terms of the NDEs, the experience itself, the neuroscience and the psychology, can you tell us a little bit about your understanding of exactly, from an academic viewpoint and from a neurochemical viewpoint, exactly what the NDE seems to be and what your research is telling you about it?
Both from a kind of neuroscience and psychological.
Yeah, absolutely. Wherever you want to go on this, because I know there's so many people out there that are fascinated by the NDE experience in general. Here's an opportunity to speak to somebody who really has drilled into the subject. So feel free for 5 or 10 minutes and just tell us a little bit about it, you know, from the history of it even.
Yeah, well, there's a lot. There's a lot. I mean, there's a lot to say with NDEs, especially now, because there really is a peak's interest in it now. And it's interesting to think why. I mean, it's somewhat parallel to the psychedelic renaissance, when, since the turn of the millennium, really, there's been such a massive mushrooming of this, you know, interest in psychedelics. And so, yeah, the near-death experience has also had something of a similar nature. There's as the Gimo Borjigin's work, as we've touched on, in Michigan, and then there's also actually a group in University of Liège, the Coma Science Group, which are doing really excellent work. They're neuropsychologists, so there is a neurological component they're looking at, but it is mainly neuropsychological. So it's kind of questionnaire data, but is really revealing. They really know their literature as to the older near-death stuff. So in terms of the neuroscience, I mean, that's why it's interesting to compare it with DMT, because it's an it's somewhat outmoded now, you know, that there's this one size fits all kind of trigger for what happens with the near-death experience. Like, even all the hype with DMT and ketamine, it can't possibly be that there's just one major event which dictates, you know, essentially the experience at the point of death. It's too simplistic, and so there's so much happening in the brain at the point of death with NDEs, that these kinds of singular models, be it DMT or ketamine, they may well play a role, but that's all they'll play, and it's a real smorgasbord of all things that happen in the brain. I think I like to think of it like there's actually a guy who was interviewed, who's one of the interviewees and participants in Strassman's work with DMT, and he comes across this kind of kaleidoscopic array, and he calls it like the picture puzzle pattern door, and he sort of talks about this a lot, and that's what it's. And then Strassman obviously relating all the experiences to near-death experience, but I find the neuroscience of the near-death experience is very, well, and the psychology is very much this picture puzzle pattern door scenario. It's like all these different components coming from different areas of the brain, maybe at different times, different, you know, higher level neuroelectric activity, and a cascade of neurotransmitter activity. All of that coming together may well build the overall picture of what the NDE is, and so it's a complex tapestry. So that each contributes to a particular part of the near-death experience, but not only that, because that in itself is probably too linear. It's probably very much an interactive process. I mean, the brain is just one big knot, you know, everything that happens, it influences something else. And even in the very forefront of neuroscience research and consciousness research is that it's about integration, and the brain is an integration machine, and how much integration there is the exact corresponder to how much consciousness there is. So once these different moving parts in the brain that might contribute to near-death experience integrate together, it could create something novel for the experience. So there's just the process of anoxia, so lack of oxygen there, which is basically the final convergence point with the classical near-death experience. If it's heart attack or drowning or whatever, it's lack of oxygen to the brain. That could well disinhibit the temporal lobes, and especially the medial temporal lobe, or the posterior part of the temporal lobe, the TPJ, the temporal parietal junction. And that is known to, when there's a disruption there, that's known to quite reliably produce out-of-body experiences. And there's also the temporal lobes, I think, quite a hot zone for this, because, or the insula, at least, that's kind of like the fifth kind of lesser known like lobe, which is kind of just it's just ventral to it. There's the insula, and that is very, very important for, well, when people have insular seizures, there's a sense of ecstasy, and there's also again, combined with the temporal parietal junction, the theory of mind is very important. That's these areas which seem to mediate theory of mind, which is the idea of mentalizing, putting your mental feet in another person's shoes, so you're empathizing with them. Even the ability to sense that there's another agency around you. So this could be involved in the entity encounter.
So this is again coming down to the Persinger work as well, I guess. I don't know if Persinger worked, whether there was a link maybe between the TPJ and what Persinger was doing, but this is really quite fascinating, isn't it? So it's the idea of the concept of the other and the empathy of perceiving another person is probably when we have the kind of thing of the sensed presence, isn't it?
Right, exactly. Yeah, the thing with that is just that, I mean, I think Dave mentioned on your podcast as well, which is something that was a finding of ours, which is quite mind-blowing, with people having psychedelic experiences who are aphantasic, who are mind blind. And yet, so there is, so the entity encounter is quite enigmatic. It's like, how does it happen? And you could think, well, you're getting a lot of ambiguous stimuli in the psychedelic visionary state, and your brain naturally tries to make sense of the patterns that it's seeing. And with social creatures, it makes sense for the brain to assume that there's some agency involved because there could be a threat, etc. So it's this pareidolia. You see faces, they can morph in the way that in psychedelics it happens. Every sort of moment of a stimulation can prime the next, and it can kind of snowball into this very multifarious, complex kind of experience. So it could be, due to the ambiguous sort of visual, maybe even fractal-like stimuli, which leads to that. But these people were mind blind, so they weren't seeing anything, and yet they were still having sense presence. They were still having entity encounters, which is fascinating. But then it could still very much be due to what I was saying about the parts of the brain which seem to undergird the sense presence and that effect. But then this is neuroreductionism, really. I mean, at the end of the day, the experiences are so ridiculously profound. And I've got a paper coming out soon, hopefully looking at this in much more qualitative detail. But Davis, last year from Johns Hopkins, recently just did a survey, a very big, brilliant survey on the DMT entity encounter. And, really because it's so vast in itself, you can do one paper. It was actually quite a long paper all on that. And it even still doesn't really scratch the surface of how profound these encounters are. So it's how, the messages that they convey, the level of insight, the godlike nature of them. They can even, there can be prophecy involved. These are kind of entity encounters which aren't just exclusive to DMT or near-death experiences, but you know, have kind of been with us since time immemorial. So it's like, how can the brain really do something like that? Yeah.
Because that's I'd never thought about that before. So it's really interesting the way you were talking about pareidolia and the idea that the brain is creating, or something is creating imagery. And that imagery, we then impose upon that imagery a proper image, like, you know, seeing a map of Ireland in the sky when you see a cloud, as Kate Bush said. And the idea that these images, like with the lucid light device, that there is the original stimuli that's taking place, but then there is this overlay of us trying to make sense of what we're seeing. And by making sense of it, we put it into a category, as you say, like it's the predator or it's something that's dangerous that's taking place. I'd never thought about that before, that, you know, there's this second level that's taking place here.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the most embraced models of how the brain works now in recent years, which is called predictive processing. And if you don't apply predictive processing to, at least on some level, to any experience or any phenomenon which involves the brain, you'll end up missing like a great deal. Like it's it's very hot, predictive processing. Yeah, the idea that the brain, the way it actually fundamentally functions is by prediction, and it actually learns about the environment over evolutionary and developmental time, such that it can incorporate into itself its own internal model of the world. And then everything else on top of that, everything that is actually processed by the brain from the external world, is only a sliver. And it's that sliver which relates to changes in the environment which are different to the internal model that it already has. And so you end up being a predictive organism, such that you will end up projecting the ideas that you already have onto the reality that you're kind of experiencing.
That again is intriguing, isn't it? It begs some fascinating questions about, again, the idea of agency here, the idea of whatever is going on inside my brain is making decisions for me and is learning things that I'm not learning. In effect, it's doing other processes in my mind, in my brain, to change the way I perceive the external environment. And these are incredibly, and this is the point when you get into neurology, don't you? You very quickly then again get into the philosophy of mind, you get into all these fascinating areas. And I think the very important point you made there was that if these are just kind of wrongly interpreted processes that the brain is doing, why are they so profound? Why are they so life-changing? Why is it that the information that is given by, whether they're entities or whatever, that seems to resonate with us in a much deeper level than just ordinary, that we're misinterpreting the stimuli in some way? You know, it is fascinating. Now, in terms of the present day understanding then of the classic near-death experience, can you take us through what the latest research is saying is taking place in the brain at the moment of death? We talked about hypoxia and anoxia and everything else, but in layman's terms, in layperson's terms, what takes place in the brain as the human body starts to shut down and death starts? What takes place in the brain that brings about these things?
Yeah, well, it's a new burgeoning field, I think, the kind of cognitive neurobiology of the dying process. And you have to look at that. It's obviously difficult to do in human beings, so it's lots of being done on rodent models, kind of, you know, less souls. And that then is going to inform the near-death experience, because really in the past the near-death experience has been very not as solid and quite very theoretical, because they haven't actually been looking at these rodent models. So we said that about the anoxia and the potential temporal lobe disinhibition, but yeah, it's not just the temporal lobe inhibition. So in these rat models, like in Gimo Borjigin's lab, they are finding really quite immediately after the onset of cardiac arrest or euthanasia, there's just a titanic upregulation of these different neurotransmitters, and it's within the first minute, and it goes
which
on.
Which neurotransmitters, with GMO's work, which neurotransmitters, and it's after the rat has been killed, isn't it, that there's suddenly the upsurge? Yeah. Which neurotransmitters suddenly become hyperactive?
There is, so John Dean was working with her and did find DMT, and as Dave mentioned, it was about 6 times baseline that it jumped up to. So there is that, but then with GMO, so they found some years before that it was really all of them, but the kind of core ones that they highlighted were the monoamines, so that's serotonin, dopamine, noradrenaline, and then the major inhibitory and excitatory neurotransmitters, glutamate, the excitatory, and GABA, the inhibitory. But serotonin is the one that interests me most, because obviously that is the system in your brain which psychedelics act upon. They mimic it, and they specifically activate the 5-HT, the serotonin 2A receptor. So it's contentious as to whether or not serotonin itself is psychedelic, but there is some evidence that when you give enough, the rodent, let's say if you're given serotonin to it, it will give this behavioral proxy that indicates it's having a psychedelic experience. So, but it's still, the jury's out on that. But the fact that serotonin was increased the most out of all of them, I just think you can't deny. It's so interesting. But again, this is, when people have near-death experiences, when humans have the NDE, it doesn't really go more than a few minutes. And it's difficult to exactly match the time course of how it happens in humans compared to how it happens in these rats. Because, this massive serotonin upregulation, for instance, is after several minutes. So is that possible to scale up to human beings who, only very, very, very few would have total lack of oxygen to the brain for those several minutes? It's still very possible. I don't think that the alignment is so misaligned such that you can't correspond the rat data to the human data. I think it's so compelling, but it's just important to remember that there's death compared to near death.
Did Borghigian et al. Did the spike take place 100% of the time, or is it just observed in some cases?
I can't fully remember, but I'm pretty sure it was definitely the vast majority. I'm not sure if it was all of them. I'm kind of tempted to say all of them, but don't quote me on that.
And what other set of circumstances do we know of that, under normal circumstances, that a mammal or a human being or whatever would have a similar uptake of neurotransmitters, that particular cocktail? Are there other circumstances that's analogous to this or as similar to, that we can say this is what the rat might have been experiencing, because we know that when these neurotransmitters activate in this particular way, this is what somebody experiences?
You mean if there's similar circumstances amongst human beings,
I don't
might involve this kind of similar massive surge in these transmitters? I would highly doubt it, because it's such a crazy neural event. It seems to be unprecedented and therefore kind of unique to the dying process. I mean, if you read Jimo's papers, she kind of talks about and discusses it being not sure, I can't remember how much depth she goes into it, but it's like this evolutionary program. I mean, the point of her paper is there's this corticocardiac signaling. So there's this signaling between the brain and the heart. And it seems that the activity, this terminal activity, seems to be a kind of process to save the organism. But actually, because she's studying and therefore garnered data from rats that did die, when the organism realizes that it's the kind of past the point of no return, the the corticocardiac signaling facilitates the death process. So the brain actually sends a signal to kind of stop the heart.
Wow.
So it is this, yeah, it's really, yeah, the implications of that. So it seems quite a unique death program. Yeah, but then what is so interesting is the fear death experience. So you can talk to a Kingdom Calm about all the different nuances of the neurological activity which might undergird the near-death experience, but then people have near-death experiences when there's not even trauma to the brain, let alone like global hypoxia. You know, you can just be under the expectation that imminent death is about to happen, the so-called fear death experience. And there has been work in this other place that I mentioned to you, the University of Liège, who compared, I think the methodology could have been much better personally, but it's still really interesting that the people who just had these NDE-like experiences, so it's quite heterogeneous, so it's not just fear death experiences, but there's different kinds of experiences like hypnosis, meditation, stuff like that, but still there's no brain trauma in the way that we're talking about with Gmo's work. You know, I found when comparing them to actual near-death experiences, the phenomenology is the same, it's kind of indistinguishable. However, they didn't go into the real qualitative nitty-gritty of all the details of the experience, which I imagine would be very, very different.
There's I wonder if there's a missed opportunity there. You're saying that this research is taking place at the University of Leeds, presumably within the psychology or neurology. Pardon?
Liège.
Liège.
Oh,
right. Yeah. Okay. Because I was going to be saying that there could be a degree of synergy here with the work that's been done by Chris Moulon at the University of Leeds in terms of déjà vu and déjà vu experiences, because of course you could parallel déjà vu experiences with the panoramic life review, for example. One of the things that I'm very keen to talk to you about as well is we're talking about the neurological aspects here as well, but there's also the cultural aspects and the way in which the near-death experience is experienced across differing cultures, you know, the anthropological aspects of this. Have you been looking into that as well?
Yeah, well, I'm really excited about the new wave of NDE research, because I didn't really see much excellent like cross-cultural research in the kind of, you know, from the 80s. But there's a guy who I love, Gregory Shushan, and you know, it may even be cool for you to get him on your show, because he's just an amazing academic. And I think it's 2009 and then 2018 he brought out studies, really in-depth studies. The first one being early civilizations' concepts of the afterlife. And so he was kind of reviewing all the kind of major texts and belief systems as to the afterlife in these early civilizations, select the early civilizations, and comparing that to what we kind of know about what the modern near-death, what the modern near-death experience looks like, to say that, you know, they weren't so modern after all necessarily, you know, that there's too many uncanny parallels, such that, you know, he's putting forward the case that the near-death experience we've known for a long time, it means just this weird contemporary, you know, Western phenomenon. It goes back and back and back in ancient experience, potentially even since the very first people started dying, right? And having these experiences, and it was those which actually seeded the religious imagination. You know, it facilitated our first religions, and our after beliefs especially. But that was that. But then he really followed that on more rigorously by looking at near-death experience, like actual near-death experiences in indigenous communities. Again, finding that all the same structures were there, you know, the kind of the core experience that Moody and Ring, the early researchers, you know, set out, they're all there. But what was most interesting is that he was able to get actual first-hand reports of indigenous peoples being asked by anthropologists and missionaries, even writers about them, about where they got their afterlife beliefs from, or, you know, the sources of their of their religious, ideations and stuff. And they quite matter-of-factly, a very many number of times said, well, this person who in their kind of mythology, cosmology, would they kind of consider as like a hero, but very often actual lived people in the past, he died and he came back and he told us about all of these experiences. And so, this idea that NDEs were the precursor to kind of modern religion.
That again is intriguing. And again, one of my associates, a few years ago, I wrote a book on near-death experience, or edited a book with Dr. Mahendra Pereira. Mahendra is an expert on near-death experience. He's a psychiatrist in Australia, and he's an expert on near-death experiences in the Sinhalese community. And again, he said the number of parallels that he could draw. And I know that Ornella Corazza has done a lot of work, hasn't she, within the Japanese community as well. And of course, this brings us on, doesn't it? And again, it's an intriguing idea that the near-death experience could be the cause of religious beliefs, or at least a belief in another world that is other than this one. Because one of the major aspects of the near-death experience is the transformational aspects. And I know, again, individuals like a prior guest on this, Penny Satori, has written a book recently about these effects. So it's as if you see something more in the world that you bring back from the near-death experience, isn't it? And there should be more work done on this, because we've always assumed that it's just people bring about religious belief systems purely and simply because it's a way of explaining the world, whereas in fact it's not. It's a response to people's experiences. That moves us on, doesn't it? From there, if we can then move on to the idea of psychedelics and how psychedelics work and the parallels between them as well, specifically DMT. So if you can just explain a little bit for the guys out there, and again, apologies, folks, I really must pull myself back to realize that we're doing an interview here, that there are people listening in, but what Pascal is talking about is so germane to my work. I'm gaining an awful lot from this, and I'm likely to ask the oddest of questions because it's something that intrigues me. But moving on to the role of DMT, and can you tell us a little bit about what we mean when we talk about dimethyltryptamine, and why is it linked so much to altered states of consciousness?
Why it's linked to altered state of consciousness? Well, it is a psychedelic, and the word means to manifest the soul or reveal the mind. And it's an interesting one because it's just so replete in nature. And we are, us ourselves as human beings, part of nature. It's actually very much in us. It's endogenous, and therefore, and it's not just any psychedelic. It's an unbelievably profound psychedelic, which has this propensity to propel us into other spaces, and other spaces populated by apparent agencies, other worlds. So that in and of itself, you don't really have to go much further than that, is just a phenomenal fact. So that's why it was interesting to consider the near-death experience, because that is, for all intents and purposes, what the near-death experience is. It's it's being catapulted to another space with these where you encounter other beings, and it's obviously a neurological event on some level when at the point of death. And DMT, being a constituent of our brains, could facilitate that, or have a role facilitating that. I mean, it's there's a lot of, so again, this is why the paralleling of the psychedelic and the near-death experience is so important, because DMT, can be used as a model, a simulator of the near-death experience in a way that's empirically manipulatable. You can give it to people, you can scan their brains, and you can get a sense of what might be happening in the brain, even in the near-death experience when you die. So in kind of answer to your question about how it relates to altered states or gives rise to that, I mean, the neuroimaging work with psychedelics is just phenomenal, and can be so informative as to the NDE. I mean, it it's essentially how it works is it disintegrates the default mode network, which is a particular part of the brain, which is really nicely named. Usually in science, they give weird arcane names to things, but it is the default mode that we all inhabit. The ego mind, which is self-reflective. It's mind wandering about positioning yourself in the past and the future. It's just what we're in now. And it disintegrates that. And that means it makes the organization of the different nodes that it consists of less organized, and that then gives way to just this hyper-connected brain state where it would normally inhibit different areas of the brain talking to each other. But once it's disinhibited, different parts of the brain which would normally not associate with each other suddenly become, best friends, and they're
so this is the classic bergsonian attenuator, isn't it? The idea of the opening the doors of perception. It's the idea, isn't it, that it breaks down and it stops the brain working in one way to make it linked in other. This is intriguing. Please go on.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's actually something I wanted to get to, because it keeps coming up in conversations. And I think it's so important to reiterate that I think that it is and it isn't the bergsonian filter. Because the question is, so the psychedelic neuroscience is certainly accepting and revealing that the brain is a filter of some nature, is a constrainer of consciousness. But the way that they conceptualize it in the neuroscientific framework is that there are very many different levels to the brain, and there's more modern developed parts of the brain compared to deeper archaic parts of the brain. The kind of latter being more akin to the unconscious and the former more akin to the conscious mind. And with these psychedelics like DMT, it takes away the default mode, these other high cortical areas, meaning that the deeper areas, the more archaic areas, are disinhibited, and therefore the psychical content which they represent is released into conscious awareness. So it's kind of like with the bergsonian filter, it's like the brain is a filter. Once it's turned off, consciousness is actually higher, and therefore where you can develop ideas as to the consciousness is coming from elsewhere. And it's only when it kind of interacts with the brain that it's constrained down and funneled down into what Huxley called like that measly trickle of consciousness. But the neuroscience, this in psychedelic neuroscience, is saying, well, it's not necessarily coming from this other as yet unidentified source. It's coming from the deep wells of our cortical
So this
network.
is almost, isn't it, going back, and I can't remember, Paul somebody or other came out with the triune brain theory many years ago, the idea of the reptilian brain and the mammalian brain. I know it's a very crude analogy there, but effectively what you're saying is that it makes us go deeper into our own almost history, almost the way the development of the brain. So we're going further in rather than going further out, which I don't know if you've read my book, The Outer Body Experience, but I have something I call the intrasomatic experience. And the idea that, we go inwards, we don't go outwards. We assume we're going outwards, but we're going deeper in and deeper down into that kind of dark sea of the subconscious that's inside all ourselves. So yeah, I really like that. So the simplistic model of the Bergsonian, the idea that it's cutting things out and it's taking that away from us. I think it's C.D. Broad, wasn't it, came up with a similar phrase, and of course Aldous Huxley. But this is far more interesting to me because
it's more based in the kind of vanguard neuroscience. But the thing is, and I like how you said the intrasomatic experience, because I've termed something the intra-body experience as well, which we see on our DMT participants, where it seems like they're gaining access to their own molecules, or at least molecules, or something that just looks a lot like molecules. And maybe it's a bit too radical to say that it's this intra-body experience, but yeah, for sure. I mean, that's somewhat separate, but with the idea of this internally inflecting consciousness, getting into the deeper wells of kind of repressed or otherwise covered experience. Because what I was relating earlier about the psychedelic neuroscience, it seems very reductionist, but I'm always very careful to be informed as much as possible as to what the actual nuts and bolts, theories are as to the thank God neuroscience, but still having an open mind as to the implications of that, the possible transpersonal dimensions of that, because I think even if you reduce as much as possible, we still, especially when it comes to the brain and consciousness, and we just still don't know enough about it such that it could still accommodate other realities that the kind of initial reductionist model wouldn't. And like you say about the darkness of the unconsciousness that we can tap into, I mean, and the history that we tap into, as you mentioned, in an archetypal sense, in the sense of the kind of Jungian collective unconscious, which in itself has, these different theoretical parallels with obviously the Akashic record is an ancient Indian idea, and then the kind of more modern morphic resonance and field idea by Sheldrake, who himself said he basically just took it from the Akashic.
Well, of course, on top of this, you can then add into this the orchestrated objective reduction of Hammerhoff and Penrose, and the idea that it's being drawn up through the microtubules, and therefore is it drawing up from some kind of 0 point field, and is the communication taking place there? And I'm also thinking of, one of the major problems, and I don't know whether it is still a problem in raised commas within neurology, but the binding problem and the idea, how do different parts of the brain seemingly instantaneously communicate with each other when the actual transmission rate within the neurons isn't fast enough for that communication to take place, so is there some kind of non-local communication going on within the brain? So does it mean that in some way entheogens like DMT somehow integrate the brain in a kind of a holographic way to allow us to create something greater, because of course the central point of holograms is that the whole contains the parts and the parts contain the whole. And I know that people like Carl Pribram had argued many years ago that you can explain how the brain functions if you see it working holographically in some way. And one of the things that in my last book I touched upon, which would be really interesting to just discuss for a second as to whether I'm way off kilter here, is that there's something I think called the ion wave or something. I can't remember the guy that came up with it now, where there's a kind of a wave of calcium ions that go right across the brain very, very quickly. And this is what brings about this feeling of simultaneity that we shouldn't have, should we? There's no way we should have a feeling that everything is happening now, because different parts of our brain are processing things at different times. So there must be either a buffering taking place within the brain, or what? There's an area of discussion here, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And there was a researcher when I was doing my undergrad looking at calcium, especially calcium ion communication, especially in the 90% of the brain which is sorely neglected, which are the glial cells.
I know, exactly. That was the point. It's the glial cells, isn't it?
Yeah.
The way we dismiss the glial cells, they're just glue. Whereas in fact, 70% of the brain is glial cells, isn't it? It's glial cells.
I think more.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's particular subtypes which are like the astrocytes and the oligodendrocytes, but particularly the astrocytes, and the calcium that they seem to kind of facilitate, that's related, that will definitely have some relationship to cognition. I mean, I've seen that before, and that they, because if we're talking about one way that it seems this binding problem is being approached and could be explained is through the idea of the integration of the brain and the connection of the brain. And the astrocytes, well, they're the glue, like you say, that's what glia actually means in Greek. So they can facilitate this very rapid and efficient binding of the brain. So the consciousness binding problem, is going to be predicated on the neural binding, and the glia could certainly could be instrumental to that. But in terms of psychedelics, Michael Winkelmann is an anthropologist, come neuroanthropologist, and he talks about the integrated mode of consciousness. And so, because he's really an anthropologist and he writes about shamanism, that involves psychedelics, ayahuasca, etc., but also other ways of developing altered states. But ultimately, it converges on this integrated mode of consciousness, which is basically what I was just saying about, if you actually look at the kind of the subtle mechanisms of the psychedelic state in the brain, the default mode network is disintegrated, and suddenly there's this hyper connectivity of the brain. It's fully integrated, is a global system, and you still need a lot more sort of research to fully know about the kind of EEG effects, when they put people onto psychedelics under the cap, which records your electrical signals from your cortex. But it seems that gamma activity isn't that prominent. It certainly does happen in some literature that I've read. Seems to be ayahuasca, which can give rise to that. But gamma is the activity, the frequency band, which is very high frequency and is usually implicated in this binding problem, because it allows more disparate areas of the brain to talk to each other. Long range connectivity, functional connectivity, that's what it's called, like long range kind of in the brain. And so it could that's definitely important in the binding problem.
And the communication levels, that's neuronal communication rather than glial, and is it interbacular?
It's neuronal.
Right.
So there'll be different levels, right? So there'll be kind of anatomical levels which will allow the connectivity, and then there'll be functional levels, like in these electrical activities with gamma. So what EEG measures is the cortical activity of the neurons as opposed to the glia.
Because there's various points that are sort of lighting up in my brain in various places at the moment in terms of this. And the one that I was immediately thinking of was that, of course, we're talking here about either hemispheres of the brain, aren't we? Or is there communication across the corpus callosum in these circumstances? Because presumably only one part of the brain can communicate in that way, because otherwise it'd have to go across the corpus callosum to communicate the right and left hemispheres, wouldn't it? Or am I misinterpreting that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it would, it's definitely bihemispheric.
Right, it is bihemispheric, which is intriguing in itself. Has anybody ever done any experimentation when somebody is using substances such as DMT as to what happens within the glial network of the brain rather than the neuronal network? Has that ever been done?
I haven't seen that. But there was something, not on the kind of cognitive biology level, but I think you had Edie Frexer on, I think, didn't you?
I did, yes, yeah. We must get him back on again. We must get him on this.
Yeah, he did do, I'm pretty sure he exposed astrocytes or other glia cells in an in vitro scenario to hypoxia or other pro-inflammatory conditions, and then introduced DMT into the system, and it was, glial protective or anti-inflammatory, because these glia have a lot to do with the immune system and inflammation system. So on that level, on the kind of cellular level, DMT has been applied and it affects it, but I have no idea as to the macro level, but that would be really fascinating.
Yeah, because there's so many areas here that can be pursued. We can stay within the almost the materialist reductionist model here. We don't need to actually go into any other areas, because there's so fascinating areas in terms of just looking at the neurochemical aspects of this. But in terms then of DMTs and NDEs and things, can we go on a little bit more about the similarities? You've touched upon the work of Rick Strassman and other researchers. I'm very intrigued about the pursuing a little bit more the entity encounters. We touched upon them with David Luke, and we've done so with other guests, but I'm really interested to see from your point of view, what's your take on what you think might be going on in terms of these encounters. Are they real? Are they racial memories? Are they us attuning into some other field? What do you think is taking place there?
Well, it's such a bamboozling question. I don't have the answer to, but yeah, my feeling, as I was kind of intimating that before, is that you don't have to fully subscribe to a reductionist perspective that it's all in the brain, it's brain produced, but you don't also have to just resort to a purely transcendentalist opinion, in that they are these actual interdimensional, divine or alien beings that are completely independent of us. I do think that there's a middle way, and it's just easy to dichotomize because we're simple beings and we're trying to understand things simply. So yeah, I mean, like you were kind of talking about with Neil Rushton and Dave, and there's these entities. Well, first of all, in terms of near-death experience and DMT experience, there was always the meme of the elves in DMT experiences, which is kind of propagated by McKenna somewhat, the self-transforming machine elves. And then by the kind of turn of the 90s, there was this interesting shift, which became more, well, insectoid. I mean, there was certainly before that, because the UFO phenomenon happened from 47, and then gradually took up a lot of speed in terms of inculcating into the cultural psyche. And then in DMT experiences as well, you saw a lot of similar beings that you might see in abduction phenomena. And in our DMT studies, we didn't find many elves. There was other people who didn't find very many elves either. It's an important one to differentiate, though, because there's elves and then there's elves. There's elves in the silly way that everyone understands. I think Rushton referred to it as like the Tinkerbell kind of archetype. And we didn't see any of that. But we did see a fair few of entities which were elf-like in their demeanor, in their behavior, in the function that they kind of offered. But they just looked different, you know, and that's a superficial thing, really, how they look. It's yeah, I mean, that they're kind of playful and, you know, trickster-esque, dancing, you know, these kinds of sort of domains. We did see that. You don't see anything like that in the near-death experience. And again, the other types of entities that you see in DMT are basically kind of infinite. You know, my qualitative analysis, that was the biggest category. It's just endless different types of beings that I was trying to subcategorize, and how they looked, you know, again, insectoid, serpentine, you know, in a similar kind of way to the beings that you might see in abductions. But again, you don't see any of that in near-death experiences. So it's very interesting that the kind of subpopulation of features that you see in near-death experience seem to be somewhat more prescribed. That in itself is fascinating. But then that cluster you can see in DMT experiences. But then you got this whole other litany of things, the kind of Akashic record, for all intents and purposes, that you can get from DMT experiences.
This is where it comes down to, I don't know if you've read my latest book, but I'm very interested in what I'm calling the egregorial. And this is the idea that there's a kind of a feedback mechanism whereby it's our own anticipation. So in many ways, it's mind created, and we're drawing it up from our own subconscious. But there's also an element of then almost like tulpa-like creation of an entity that is somehow independent of you, but dependent upon you. Now, I'm thinking here along the lines of the point you were saying about UFOs since 1947 and Arnold and everything else. If you carry that forward,
sorry, you broke up there. Sorry, a little bit. Oh, sorry. What?
It has, as you know, with UFOs, you know, since 1947 and Arnold and everything else. If you trace that through, and as a sociologist, I'm interested in that kind of area, you see that the entities change depending upon the social mores, and that they are very much attuned to what people's expectations of the aliens are going to be. Now, there's a counter argument to say, well, they culturally track in some way because that's what they're doing. But I'd argue they culturally track because there are expectations of what they do. So as they move through, you know, we had the idea of the Nordics, and we had the Space Brothers, then we had the Greys, then we had the Insectoids, then we had this kind of amalgam after E.T. and everything else as well. And of course, the classic book cover of Whitley Strieber's Communion, where we had the classic grey then, and people start seeing them in this way. Now, I just wonder whether this, because this is part and parcel of the belief system of ufology, and to an extent after McKenna has become part of the belief system of DMTs and the DMT and elves and everything, whereas I think the near-death experience community are quite different, they're more insular. So therefore, they follow the tropes of more religious belief systems where you will see Jesus or you'll see dead people. And they haven't got to this strangeness. But I'm noticing over time that the egregores are changing within the near-death experiences as well. We're having more DMT-like experiences. For instance, Ibn Alexander, when he had his near-death experience, describes riding on the back of a giant butterfly and the colors that are involved here. And I think then we need to link these in to the experiences people have when they're in aura states, in terms of temporal lobe epilepsy, in terms of migraine, in terms of schizophrenia. And it seems that it's expanding outwards. It seems that there's more to this than singularly that they're dead people or they're aliens or whatever. It's more intriguing than that, isn't it?
For sure. Yeah. It's always more intriguing than just matter-of-factly saying that it is these things which independently exist and that are kind of non-fluid. You know, these are altered states of consciousness, and so they're going to be related to our own consciousness. And I think, I mean, it's very interesting what you say as to whether, especially with the kind of psychedelic renaissance, people being turned on more to that, having the experiences, learning about the experiences, it inculcates into the kind of cultural psyche, and then anyone having a near-death experience, because of course, got to remember, it's not about the insular near-death community, which I kind of agree with. I very much agree with you on that. But it's anyone has near-death experiences.
True.
So it's whatever is in their mind. Yeah. But still, it would be interesting to see the general cultural shifts, how that influences the content of near-death experiences. But I think I've come to think that one of these nuanced, quasi ontologies, is that that is about dreams and dream space, and that consciousness is dreamlike in itself, and therefore its relationship to material reality is dreamlike. And so when we talk about people having these, let's say, entity encounters which match their expectations, there's obviously a host of anecdotal experiences of people having direct communications with these particular entities who are completely naive, who have no idea about these experiences. And so it then lends, and that's just one example, there's plenty of other things which lends to this model of interconnected consciousness. And I think one amazing reference point for understanding interconnected consciousness is, not just like telepathy and like shared dreams, although they are obviously fascinating, but the Global Consciousness Project, if you know about that, which situate random number generators all around the world and have done, like, I think, decades. And when there's major events,
which is the work that was done
9/11.
Is this the Dean Radin at Per, the stuff?
Princeton?
Yeah.
And so 9/11 is an example. And when you look at the charts, there's a massive spike at 9/11 as to the random number generator suddenly becoming not so random in very, very significant ways. But the most amazing thing about that, which is a whole other level, which I have no explanation for, obviously, is that it was a matter of hours before the first plane strike that spike happened, suggesting not just global interconnected consciousness, but one which is somehow transtemporal.
Well, I would argue, if you recall, in my first book, Is There Life After Death, I have the concept of the daemon. And of course, the daemon I consider to be our higher self, which effectively is the part of you that's lived this life before. So therefore, precognitive elements are actually facilitated by demonic consciousness or demonic unconsciousness.
I really like that. It's quite parsimonious.
So in which case, what is taking place when that happens is that literally the most, up until the COVID anyway, 9/11 was the most traumatic experience that any of us that lived through it have ever experienced. So therefore, if we're all living our lives again, there will be a collective feeling of, why do I feel ill at ease now? And it's because your immediate future memories are suddenly reverberating backwards and forwards, and you're suddenly picking up and going, as we get closer to 9/11, it's something's going to happen. I feel something has happened because I remember it from last time, and your daemon is screaming at you saying, oh my God, I remember this now. It's rather analogous to when you're playing a third-person computer game and you come across a set of circumstances that you've already experienced in a previous game, but you're not sure what happened and you're fearful. But as the gameplay, you remember it. But as on the on-screen sprite, the eidolon, as I'd call it, you wouldn't know. But you'd get this feedback coming through in some way. Because on this is the perfect opportunity to bring Sarah in here, because we touched in about dreams and dream entities and everything. And of course, this is Sarah's area. So maybe, Sarah, you've been sitting quietly, and I know that as you would normally be bouncing up and down, wanting to come in. So here's your opportunity.
Yeah, look, there's my notes. I'm actually not sure whether I can read them, because they're really...
Oh, wow. Amazing.
Well, one thing I wanted to say, because when we were talking to David, we were talking about your writing about NDE inspiring religious and spiritual thought. And I think NDEs were also involved, but I think dreams were the things that gave the earliest people the first indication that there may be an afterlife or an underworld, because very regularly people see people that have died in dreams. It's a very common dream to have. It's really interesting to me that in NDEs, David was saying that people are more likely to see their loved ones and people that they know. And in DMT experiences, you're more likely to see fairies or entities that you don't necessarily know, which I guess because like you were sort of saying something about, really there's this sort of interference pattern that we try to make sense of because we're like sense-making beings. And I think that that's very interesting and very true. And that the psychedelic experience is basically very similar to experiencing a dream when your eyes are open. And I did wonder about, well, one thing I wanted to bring up was this idea of NDEs in religion and culture. And I think that the mysteries and the initiation rituals in the mysteries were this ritualized NDE experience, because very often you had to think that you were going to die or you were going to be very scared. And I think it's fascinating that even if you think you're going to die, these things still happen in your mind, like you were saying, in your brain, these same things occur. I was wondering if something like acetylcholine was implicated in the NDE, because that's implicated in really vivid, memorable dreams.
That's a really interesting point. And I can't remember if acetylcholine, I'm pretty sure it was also upsurged in these rodent models of death, but not considerably. But anyway, what's more interesting is, because I love the idea about near-death experiences being not just dreamlike, but it needs to be lucid dreamlike, because obviously you're lucid, but not such that you're controlling the dream, not that, or the near-death experience, because what's actually quite important to realize about near-death experience is you basically have no control over it. That is, if you're a normal average Joe. I mean, the Tibetan like lamas and people who specifically practice the dying process, not least through lucid dream yoga, they'll be able to manipulate it or, to navigate it better. So that's fascinating in itself. There's the difference between the trained person and the average person.
A big idea in that tradition, to die well and to die in a kind of state of bliss. And in that way, you kind of escape your karmic wheel, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. In a way that such that you're aware of what's going on because you've done it before, through these simulations in lucid dreams and things like that. Exactly. I mean, even Gregory Shushan, that I mentioned, who is doing the best kind of cross-cultural research. At the end of, was it both books? But it's fascinating that he's also cottoned on to something that I really resonate with as well, and clearly yourself as well, that the near-death experience is dreamlike, and he did say that there are some instances of near-death experiences where there's some level of control, and
well, there's a bit of control for those people that come back, isn't there? There's a bit of control, like
that's
if
a good point.
Going towards the light and then they're deciding that they're not going towards the light.
Yeah, well, usually it's when they come to their encounter, and it could be a being of light. It's often their relatives. That's, yeah, you're right. This is a level of, well, whether or not it's control, it's a return, and they're either given a choice. Sometimes they're given a choice, occasionally, which is fascinating. Because I like the little nuances in the phenomenology, which is like, well, how the hell does the brain do that? You know, when they're given an actual choice, they're like given these two doors, and like, if you go down this door, you're going to go back to the pain of your racked body, you know, but we'll help you through it, and you'll have a fulfilling life, or you've got a job to do, or maybe you've done the job, you know, and so that's why there's this other door available to you, and you can, you know, go to the beyond, whatever that consists of. So yeah, but often they just really don't want to leave. They just really don't want to leave, and then they're basically just forced back. They're just like shoved. I actually had this one interviewee that literally just had this giant, like, godlike finger just just slowly just push him back into his body, and he felt himself zoom through his optic channels, his kind of occipital nerve back into his eye, which was fascinating. So there is there's that, but yeah, there's also control with the life review, which I think Shushan might have cited. But interestingly, I had a dream the night before I started my PhD into near-death experiences, which was a near-death experience. I did the scale, the Grayson scale, and I scored quite high on it, and it was incredibly NDE-like. But interestingly, it had this lucid component. So again, it was like this lucid near-death experience dream, which I personally had, and I was able to. It was only partially manipulable, but during my life review, I was scrolling through it, and the reason I was trying to scroll through it was because I knew that it meant that I was going to die, and so I was trying to screw the system, but the metaphysical system, basically. And so, yeah, I felt that if I did that, then I'd be kind of, it was either that or die, and I'd just be stuck in this loop of looking at my life. But weirdly, in the coma science group that I mentioned in Liège, their data that I've been kind of partially analyzing and using this, there was also an incident of a person scrolling through their life review, so there was somewhat element of control as well there.
One of the other things I wanted to bring up is, because when I first started doing my lecture club, actually, I had pretty much all neuroscientists. And I did get a little bit bored of the kind of reductionist idea of consciousness and psychology and everything else. And one of the things, even on a reductionist level, is there isn't much exploration into the neurons and the serotonin receptors in the gut and the neurons in the heart. And I wonder what happens with things like those, and if they've ever been measured at the near-death experience.
Yeah, I don't know about the gut. I'd be interested in that, because, yeah, I mean, I don't know about the near-death experience, but in psi generally, you know, parapsychology, extrasensory perception, I think the gut and the neuroscience of the gut, what's called the enteric nervous system, probably has a lot to do with it, because there's like Radin has done with precognition experiments of pre-sentiment, looking at physiological levels, and it's basically just like this unconscious feeling.
Gut feeling.
Yeah, it was gut feeling. So I'd be really interested in the gut activity, the enteric nervous system with that. But in terms of NDEs, I'm not sure. But in terms of the heart, like I was mentioning earlier, this brain-heart interconnectivity, which seems to be part of this dying program, evolutionary kind of inbuilt program, there is that. So the heart is unbelievable. It's not just a matter of the heart giving way and then there's hypoxia to the brain, but there's this interrelationship. It's a very dynamic interrelationship with the heart and the brain. So I know like heart math and like lots of people love the kind of organ chauvinism. Like I know you talk about electromagnetic chauvinism, right? There's like this organ, like it's all about the brain. And so some people really like to give more credence to the heart. This is a window for that. I mean, the heart is, you know, it has this relationship. The vagus nerve, for one thing, is the key connection point to the brain.
And it neurons, doesn't it have like 10,000? It has like thousands of neurons in it as well.
It has thousands of neurons. Yeah. But it's cardiac muscle. It's a muscle, right? So the massive electromagnetic spurts that it kind of gives out is musculature. But it still is interesting that it has this intimate weddedness.
Well, it's an interesting point here, isn't it? Because one thing that I've noticed in terms of your heart is that when, you know, this real idea of a painful heart really does happen, doesn't it? You know, you'll get that sharp, when you have a strong emotion, you'll get that sharp feeling in your heart, not in your head, but it's in your chest. You know, and this is something, you know, that people talk about, you know, the little arrows and everything else. But I've had that happen. And it clearly, there is, as you say, I think probably sort of cerebral chauvinism is probably another route to say that, you know, we're missing a point here. And one of the things that leapt to my mind just then was when we were talking about the brain. Of course, you know, with DMT, we know that the retina, for instance, is brain material. So effectively, you know, could there be DMT in the retina, and that brings about the hallucinations in some way? It's fascinating. There's just so many avenues we could take here. I butted in there, Sarah, but please come back. I know that you have probably more questions.
All those notes.
Yeah. Can't make much sense out of the other notes. Oh, so I was just going to ask Pascal, like, essentially, do you think that consciousness is happening outside of the body and we're picking it up, filtering it, and the brain phenomenology is as a result of us perceiving these things and trying to process them? Or do you think that consciousness arises in the human individual?
I don't know. The thing is, I don't know how much of a cop-out it is at the moment, or how much it like is literally the linchpin, because I just keep coming back to the hard problem. It's like, well, yeah, you can explain bloody everything in terms of correlates in the brain for whatever element of experience, but then they're just correlates at the end of the day. It's like that gap seems to be so absurdly unbridgeable sometimes when I think about it too much, and I wonder how people, you know, I'm just getting into this field, you know, it's not abject consciousness neuroscience research, you know, some people are literally, that's what they're working on. How it doesn't send them crazy, because I feel myself becoming crazy thinking about it too much. That gap specifically, and it's just that gap which is a chasm which is going to be reflective of all of reality on some level or another. So yeah, I mean, I just think that the hard problem is always something that just undermines reductionism, and in so doing, it can kind of suddenly give credence to all these other phenomena.
Of course, what they do is they come along, don't they, with promissory materialism, and the idea is, yes, we can, as Eccles said, and we don't understand how brain brings about self-referential consciousness of the moment, but we will do in the future.
I remember an article I read in the New Scientist, and there was something you said earlier, Pascal, that reminded me of it. And it was this idea, I guess, that as the default mode network develops, prior to this, we have a different perception of reality as we grow up, and that they made like a sort of clickbait title of it, saying that a baby experiences reality like they're on LSD. And I wonder what you think about that, like how, I guess, we become more rigid in our thinking, and our perception as a result becomes more rigid. But when I was a kid, I remember my perception being like way more flexible. And I could, even when you think about something simple like playing, I used to visually see things when I used to play games all the time. And I think kids do, they have this kind of intense imaginative power that perhaps we lose as we get a bit older. And that's things like DMT or the near-death experience, lucid dreaming, and other psychedelic drugs remind us of.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with all of that. I mean, the only thing is, because it's just a matter of degree, I guess, really, because when you have a psychedelic, once you've had a fully developed default mode network, the whole thing is functionally disintegrated. So it then lends itself to these completely cosmic, ultimately ego dissolving experiences. But that's kind of different to when you're a child and there's still the undergirding structures for the default mode network to develop, and so they're kind of still, they're residually there, or their proforms are kind of there, and so you're not experiencing everything like, you're part of your, you're not having a full-blown LSD trip, but definitely there's greater plasticity, greater creativity, and of course you are less egoic. Like, that's a fact. I mean, you're born without an ego, and that's something that develops. And so at those really early stages, you probably do have more, the earlier you go, the probably more mystical your actual first person experience as an infant is going to be. And yeah, it's interesting that you say when you were playing, you're seeing things and things. And so this idea about the default mode network, when it's reduced, and there's this hyperconnectivity, and Dave Luke has done some good research as well with synesthesia and psychedelic synesthesia, and that what's happening at the level of the brain is probably related to that, because that is sensory modalities talking to each other in a way that wouldn't normally speak to each other. And as soon as it happens contemporaneously with each other, that's why you have the contemporaneous conscious experience, and that itself is just obviously illuminating as to how the brain relates to consciousness, because when there's concurrent activity, different parts of the brain, maybe wildly different functions, it percolates into the phenomenal world. So you're a young child playing, and you've got these imaginations, mediated by different areas of your brain, which are actually talking to your visual areas of your brain, and it's kind of manifesting in the visual modality. It's exactly how psychedelics work.
I think the parallel with synesthesia there is quite an interesting one, isn't it? And again, going back to the point we were talking about the glial cells, I've suggested in Opening the Doors of Perception, I suggested that the way we could possibly explain the idea of what Halliwell called the corporal companions, the childhood friends, and the way in which the child's brain works, could be something to do with the fact of the myelination of the neurons, and maybe the neurons are leaking out information to each other, which they right. would not ordinarily do if they were myelinated. And also the development of the corpus callosum, and the corpus callosum isn't fully developed until somebody's 10 or 11 years of age. And could these be neurological, physiological reasons why we seem to shut down from this greater world of experience as we get older, because that wonderment of childhood. And I've argued that, in fact, towards the end of life, these things come back again. And this is Alzheimer's and related, and dementia, Charles Bonnet syndrome, these kind of things. Because, of course, I've argued that we interpret Charles Bonnet syndrome in elderly people, but when young children see similar things, we don't consider them to be Charles Bonnet syndrome. We just consider them to be quasi-corporal companions. But there's so similarities between the two. And I know when we had Neil on, we were discussing exactly this, the similarities here between the two of them. There are so many areas, again, and so many avenues we can shoot off on here. And I'm aware of, we've got about half an hour left. So what do you think, what lessons can we take? As somebody said earlier on in the chat room, I can't remember which one person it was now, but was about the way in which when people have transformative NDE experiences, and it's, it was like Penny Satori said, what does this tell us about what can we learn from greater society in terms of these experiences? I know it's a wide question, and it's more a question of debate rather than pure science.
Yeah.
But still one to be questioned, I think, and discussed.
Oh yeah, I think I try to balance, but yeah, I mean, I've obviously made this decision to go to the more ontological question, but you can just get lost in the questions for the sake of the questions and not think about the real reality of things. Like, regardless of reality, we're in this reality. What lessons can we take to improve this reality to, get along better and it be well? And So near-death experience is clearly, you know, an amazing resource to, well, you know, phenomena to look at for that, because they utterly transform the individual, and that's just a fact, and that is obviously scalable, you know, because more and more people are having the experience because of resuscitation technology. Not only that, more and more people are reporting the experience and therefore propagating the experience because it's becoming more mainstream and accepted. And again, I think that's important to parallel with the psychedelic renaissance. So yeah, the fact of the transformation in itself is so interesting, because like we're saying, it's just like minutes worth. I mean, it's usually a minute or less when people have cardiac arrest, you know, and the brain is, you know, lacking in activity, and yet they can go from like Vietnam snipers like Danny and Brinkley, who was a famous NDE, and become, you know, this soft-spoken, compassionate, humble, and totally other-centered, spiritually oriented person. It's just incredible that can happen in like a minute. It's just incredible. You know, because again, Bruce Grayson, and he recently brought out his book After, that I just finished reading, and that's a really amazing memoir of his whole experience being a reductionist psychiatrist, then learning for 45 years and researching near-death experiences from a psychiatric perspective, and his journey of becoming non-materialist, essentially, you know, and finding, but one of the main reasons, because he's a psychiatrist, and he, you know, it takes years of psychotherapy and pharmacotherapy to change people who have deeply inculcated, you know, psychopathologies, and yet, you know, in this instant of a near-death experience, you can be utterly transformed for the better. For the most part, for the better. If it weren't for the lack of receptivity of society to these things, it probably would be 100% for the better, because you need, just like psychedelic experiences, which these experiences echo, you need support, you need integration in order to garner all of the lessons and really you know, instantiate them in your life. I mean, these changes include, yeah, I mean, like I kind of touched on the changes, but it leads back to Gregory Shushan's work, thinking that near-death experiences might have been the precursor for religion, because they make you more spiritual. They make you believe in an afterlife, perhaps not, you know, unsurprisingly, and that in itself, and so of course they also, you know, in parallel, but don't have fear of death, and that is so important in terms of people's general malaise and unease, which also might underpin actual, like, you know, disorders of consciousness, and anxieties and things. So that, to harness that in itself, like a reduction of fear of death, is so transformative on an individual level for the near-death experiencer, but for society at large, when more people have these experiences. And not only, there's a really nice paper by the New Zealand researcher Tassel Matamoa, I think her name is, and also Ken Ring, referring to just learning about the near-death experience itself, referring to it as like the benign virus, because it's so captivating. It, you know, really just latches into people's brains and hearts, you know, to learn about these experiences, what reality might await us, or just the lessons that are taken away, regardless of, you know, the ontology of love for one's neighbor, for the golden rule, you know, so it can really transform the world, I you know, I think. And I mean, again, Ken Ring, to come back to him, he wrote the Omega Project, and he was relating people who had near-death experiences, and interestingly, people who had abduction experiences, to the shamanic experience, in a kind of way similar to what Graham Hancock was doing, although Ken Ring was majorly an NDE researcher, you know, but saying that they're like a shaman. They're these people that have these predispositions, just like the shamans may have, and they then, stimulated by being at the precipice of death, have these soul flight experiences, these experiences of spirit communication, of going to these other worlds, and of bringing back information, information that we are all one, that we're fundamentally interconnected, that there is this transcendent reality, and that, but you have to go back. That's also quite interesting, you know, that they're sent back. I mean, the shamans would obviously, willingly come back for their community's purpose, but they come back to fulfill a job. You know, it's uncanny how often they're told that. The people who, you know, when they come back in NDEs, they've got a job to do, very matter of factly, and that job may well be to disseminate the information about the experience that they had. Yeah, so it can have ripple effect, you know.
Well, I'm reminded all the time of the old concept of the Pekindarian experiences, you know, the idea of Keats's poem, I think it was, you know, where Cortez looks over and sees the Pacific Ocean. And it's the same thing, isn't it? You've looked over the precipice, you've seen this other world. And when you come back, you have the problem of being able to describe what you've experienced in human language, which must be profoundly difficult in the first place. But also you suddenly see this. And it's again analogous, isn't it, to Plato's cave? You know, the idea of the prisoner in Plato's cave. You know, he sees the world as it really is, goes back, and the other prisoners don't believe him because he doesn't have the way of describing it. And again, there's the point you made, I think, is a profoundly important one, that people suddenly experience this oneness, this idea that we're, as Bill Hicks said, we're all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. And that sudden expansiveness, the oceanic feeling that Buck talked about, you know, the idea that we are everything and everything is us. And suddenly, you know, you're back in this kind of corporate, literally, I mean, I suppose it's literally true. You're in this corporate world. You're incorporated. You're in a body within this world. And incorporation means that you're trapped within it. And I think that your points there, I was saying, God, you could stand up and make that speech you just said, and you'd have people really, really fascinated at the point you're making. And I think more and more people, as you say, and it's something I never thought of before, the impact it has on other people, not just you as the experiencer, but even reading about near-death experiences and thinking about near-death experiences takes us out of this worldview that is ultimately tragic. You know, the idea of, Michael Immanuel said, you know, the tragic feeling of life, the idea that, you know, the universe has existed for billions of years before I was born, it'll exist for billions afterwards, and I'm just a blip that's just experienced something for a short period of time and then died. You know, I
think that's a really good point. That actually, I mean, I always tend to think about these things about the, you know, the kind of subtextual angst that we're all in terms of spiritual decontextualization, and that's just an unfortunate artifact of the culture that we kind of happen to be in, and we kind of try to get out of through the subcultures that we then kind of, you know,
good point.
Infiltrate. So the near-death experience destroys that. And like you say, like, you can really, because we're so egoic, we consider ourselves in a kind of paradoxical way so small. There is that paradox. But then the near-death experience, I mean, why it's just so phenomenal for me, is why I want to dedicate my life studying it, is because it's the ultimate perforation in you know, of your brain and of kind of reality at large, because it's the terminus of our life, at least this life, and so it perforates and lets in this light which contextualizes. It suddenly contextualizes. That's what NDEs report. You know, they suddenly they realize they have this noetic experience which encapsulates for that moment all of reality, and so they have this implicit knowing of why they're here and what we're supposed to be doing here, what the purpose is, you know, kind of where we came from and where we're going. But I think this one book, and I think it was the first book I might have ever read, I might need to check that out again, of Melvin Morse's Transformed by the Light. Again, key, transformed by. A quote from a young girl. It probably was that book, because he was a pediatrician, so he did near-death work with children. And this young girl said, "Life is for now, light is for later. And that just blows my mind every time I think about it. It just, those few words from a child, from, you know, the mouths of babes, tells us that, yes, it's amazing to learn about all of this stuff. And it's important if that's an avenue to contextualizing ourselves and living a better life. But it's really, life is now, and the light comes later. And I think you get that you know, message from psychedelic experiences as well.
Yes, it's curious, isn't it, that for the vast majority of us, people who don't have these experiences, they think differently. And it's almost like evolution, in terms of evolution of the mind, has almost gone backwards, in that we are trapped in this materialist reductionist worldview. And there's nothing wrong with materialist reductionism as a scientific process. It's, you know, it's not a problem, but it does rather trap us into this materialism and the idea that you know, all that is what we see, and that's it, and what we sense. And of course, we have all these inner senses that are just as important. You know, we have a dream life. You know, why do we differentiate between the waking life and the dream life? Because they're just as intense and just as real, you know. And this is one of the things that's coming across really strongly in the interviews that Sarah and I are doing at the moment, you know, in this ongoing exercise we're doing in terms of trying to explore the really border areas of human experience. Which brings us on now, and I know that in terms of one or two of the questions you were interested in going forward, you wanted to talk a little bit about my whole cheating the ferryman and it lad concepts, which I really have the opportunity to talk about here. So by all means, if you want to comment on those.
Well, I read the book some years ago. It would be good even to get a reminder. I mean, certainly the thing that really stuck out is, I mean, certainly yeah, it's because we need theories of psi. You know, you can invoke different things, quantum non-locality, morphic resonance, and, you know, but also this idea of the Nietzschean eternal return, you know, that why we can remember the future, well, why we can tell the future is because we're remembering the future because it happened in some way already. So yeah, and that there's all these anecdotal accounts of the you know, when you have these presentiments and things, there's actually a disembodied voice or an encounter telling you these things, and this could be a disconnected but still intimately like wed part of oneself with some higher knowledge, and that knowledge may well be sourced from prior incarnation of the very same life and things like this. So that was yeah, obviously really interesting, and that yeah, I mean, yeah, and then obviously the idea about the terminal brain activity. And, you know, you were kind of originally conceptualizing it in terms of like glutamate flood and seizures that happen and the time dilation which can occur. But, you know, it could be, as I've been kind of adumbrating about all the crazy activity which happens in the brain at death, like any of that or all of that could contribute to this sense of, well, time dilation is one sense of it, but then there's also just the general transcendence of time and space, which is exactly phenomenologically what's reported. And then that could, as you were, you know, outlining in the life review, for instance, it's more like a life reliving, and you know, that could mean that you kind of asymptotically approach death and you kind of never approach it, and you kind of fall into this kind of life review, which becomes your second life, and then that happens ad infinitum. Yeah, it's just a cool you know, concept. And I think obviously you know, there's pieces of it which you know, can marry to the data and what I'm sort of looking at. Yeah.
On the time dilation thing, you know, in terms of, do we know the neurological correlates of why it is that under certain circumstances people perceive time slowing down during accidents, or, you know, what's going on in the brain there? Which I assume that glutamate was involved, but am I right, or is it more than that?
I think it's always more than just one neurotransmitter, because glutamate is the major excitatory neurotransmitter, so it will basically be involved in everything. So yeah, I mean, Dave, I haven't done much specific looking into like the neural mechanics of time perception, but some stuff I did read years ago was David Eagleman, who also does work on synesthesia, who's really cool. But Dave, my Dave, he also brought out a paper recently looking at LSD and time dilation, and obviously that's a serotonergic function. But yeah, it's a high level function and time perception. So I did read something recently about it.
Yeah, the Eagleman work was interesting. I argued in one of my books that Eagleman's ideas were very good. And you know, the experiment he did where he had people falling down, and they were supposed to be looking at a watch on that. Then if time slowed down, they'd see the imagery. I can see that argument. My problem with that was that you can never really reproduce the near-death experience, or not really the near-death, but death expectation, because the person knows they're in an experiment and they know that actually they're not going to die. So therefore, the correlates of what are taking place are going to be quite different. You know, in other words, if I'm in an experiment, I know I'm in an experiment, and yes, I know I'm going to fall, but I know I'm not going to die. Whereas if I'm like Heim's research in terms of the alpine fallers, you know, they were in positions where they did think they were going to die, and I think the vast majority of them reported panoramic life reviews. It's as if you need to be aware of the fact you are going to die, which stimulates the daemon to start the panoramic life review. And as I argue in ITLAD, what happens when your life flashes in front of your eyes is literally because the daemon realizes you're not going to die and fast forwards the past life review, because it realizes, oh, I've started it, I better finish it because this person isn't going to die. And it's only in an RDE, a real death experience, that the panoramic life review is experienced. But then we have the challenge of, where are all these memories kept? You know, if I've got a panoramic life review that is going to have all the elements of my life, and I have cases in my case files of people who have literally in that final second lived a whole lifetime and then come to, whereabouts in the brain are those memories held? You know, are they held holographically? Are they held within what we call the Akashic record? Are they drawn up from somewhere else? Because of course, memory is one of the great mysteries of the mind, isn't it? You know, where we know that memory can be stimulated in the temporal lobes, and we know from Wilder Penfield and his experiments, but that doesn't mean that memory is there, does it? It doesn't mean that because his electrode pressed on that place in the temporal lobes, that's not where the memory was located. It seemed to be drawn from somewhere else. What is the latest on memory in terms of that?
Well, I think there is a kind of, you know, consensus with the kind of, you know, modern neuroscientists that the kind of work by Lashley, who was sort of supervising Pre-Bram or predated Pre-Bram, and then Pre-Bram's work, you know, it was of its time. And so the fact that they thought that when you can splice pieces of the brain out of rats when they're learning something, and they still learn it, they still know it, but just to a lesser degree, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to throw the brain out with the bathwater, you know. It's that, you know, we now see that the brain is, again, coming back to this idea of the brain being like vastly interconnected, in a way that Bohm, you know, and Pre-Bram tried to resolve with the brain, that the brain is kind of holographic. But I think, I mean, I really know, I've by no means am I an expert on brain mechanics in general, let alone the memory trace, you know, kind of debate, and how memories are encoded and laid down. But there's certainly the idea that it is just more diffusely encoded in the brain, like semantic information, for instance, as opposed to like other forms of memory, is spread more over the cortex in a way which creates redundancy. So even if there is parts of the brain which are damaged or whatever, you'll still have access to the memory, but in less and less of a way, which doesn't necessarily have to invoke holography. But yeah, again, I don't think, yeah, it's, I mean, again, when you look at Rupert Sheldrake's stuff, the idea that memory that isn't even encoded at all in your brain can somehow be accessed, that may well be information from other people's brains, or which then in turn may have some relationship to what he conceptualizes as the morphic field. He suggests that that's where memory lies, that it's actually an inherent thing in the universe that the brain receives or has a relationship with, and so when you electrically stimulate it, it just kind of recruits that poor parcel of the morphic field, as it were, brings it into phenomenal awareness. But again, this is all speculation, but it's something which is speculated upon because there seems to be these gaps in the neuroscientific reductionist framework where, let's say, these examples of having memories which weren't even originally encoded, so there's always these veridical or otherwise corroboratable ESP or other paranormal phenomena, which I always come back to readjust my opinion about how complete the reductionist account is. But then again, I'm not an actual psi researcher. Obviously, my supervisor is. I know a lot about it. I read a lot about it, but I don't know that there is 100% unmitigated evidence for the presence of extrasensory perception. I mean, it looks like everyone in the field of parapsychology is convinced. The fact that the Stargate program in the US went on for decades and included billions of pounds of funding, it's probably still going on, but just under the covers. And the fact that Jessica Utz, who is the head of the American Statistical Association, who said that categorically it was statistically significant, very statistically significant, but maybe with small effect sizes, it's all very compelling. So when you think about that, you have to supplement that with the neuroscientific account.
Absolutely. I was hoping to then call Sarah in with people's questions from the chat room, but we seem to have lost her for a second. Well, she just disappeared just at the right point there. In terms of in terms of this, then you also wanted to talk. Oh, Sarah, you're back. One of the things that probably, I'm sorry.
I had to go and get a parcel. Sorry.
Oh, right. Oh,
did
very
I miss
nice.
The meaning of life.
Father Christmas.
Gutted.
Yeah. Sorry.
What I was going to suggest, sir, is that we could take the opportunity now for the last 10 minutes or so to probably any questions that are in the chat room or any comments in the chat room that you can feed back to Pascal.
Yeah, there were quite a lot, but it's actually, hang on, a bit tricky to see. Danny said, in contrast with the reduction of fear of death, there's a kind of anecdote from Ram Dass's life when he had a stroke and he found the experience disappointing. Is there anyone, like you were saying, like most people end up being much nicer after that NDE, but is there any stories of people being like right arseholes after they've had a NDE experience?
Funnily enough, I haven't heard a single account of that, or at least them becoming more of an arsehole. But I do. But yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, I haven't heard the Ram Dass thing. Was he disappointed because he had a stroke and nothing happened, or was he disappointed because he actually had a near-death experience and it wasn't quite like the mind-blowing meditative experiences as he might have had or something? I don't know.
It's because it wasn't as good as his psychedelic experiences.
Oh, his psychedelic experiences, yeah. It wasn't as good as his psychedelic experiences. Genius. Yeah, I mean, yeah, but again, that's interesting because I'm looking at the parallel between near-death and psychedelic experiences. And yeah, I mean, it depends on because interesting, because he just had a stroke. So I don't know what the nature of his stroke was, but that's usually somewhat local. And so it might have disabled part of his brain. I mean, depends where he have it in the brain. Jill Bolshy-Taylor is a great example of basically her whole hemisphere having just the stroke and being offline, and that led to this massive disinhibition of the kind of more anterior right part of her brain, and she had this mystical experience. So yeah, maybe he just had a stroke, an unfortunate part of the brain, the kind of appendix of the brain, who knows. But yeah, I mean, to be less tongue-in-cheek, like the near-death experience can have really negative effects, but again, similarly as the psychedelic experience, because even if you have a
bad
good
NDE.
psychedelic experience. Pardon?
Basically, you can get a bad NDE.
Yeah, you can, just like you can get a bad trip,
Sort of
you
Scrooge.
can get a bad NDE. A what?
Like Scrooge in the Muppets Christmas Carol.
Well, yeah, but then in his case, it was quite harrowing. But then it led to all these wonderful transformative effects, and he became less of an egoist, right? But yeah, certainly, even you can have what's called distressing, but I prefer to refer to them as challenging near-death experiences, and that can have, there's probably more than what's recounted because of, maybe repression, just don't want to talk about it, etc. But even in those good experiences, because they're so just out of this world, and so something that, because the everyday person has, the combination of the fact that an everyday person can have it, who hasn't thought about any of this stuff their entire life, and suddenly has a transformative, transcendent, mystical experience suggestive of entirely new reality. It's called ontological shock. When that happens, it's not just shock, it's trauma. And the idea of ontological shock really comes out of trauma psychotherapy. And so you need supportive framework. I actually wrote a recent article actually that will hopefully be out soon, really kind of addressing this. Near-death experiences they're especially vulnerable, and therefore need a more solid psychotherapeutic infrastructure, really, to integrate, again, to learn from the psychedelic sphere, to integrate their experiences so they can really live life to the full in the way that their NDE is should otherwise allow.
I think that's a really good point, actually, because what you brought up earlier about the fact that, and I did think about this as well, is, like you say, anyone could experience an NDE, whereas people that experiment with psychedelic drugs tend to have certain personality traits and types that you can kind of mark down and note. And one thing that I can imagine might happen to NDE people that have experienced NDEs is they get kind of sucked into religious organizations, potentially, because they try to find a framework that makes sense out of these experiences, and they're drawn to those kind of things in the same way that very vulnerable people who have lost loved ones might be shafted by mediums that aren't necessarily all that authentic or philanthropic.
Yeah, that could happen. Again, it's similar to what happens with psychedelics. So, like Charles Tart, wrote a paper about how like it's uncanny how like monks, Buddhist monks, so many of them, when they come from the West, they are converted due to LSD, early LSD experiences, like from the 60s and stuff. So again, it's similar, not such in a way that you might be kind of lured by the religious institutes, but they can really offer a transcendental framework to understand the experience, which just materialist society just is so ignorant and devoid of. So it can really be great for near-death experiences, but then usually what happens is that they don't affiliate with the actual what's the word, institutionalized religion, because they just see kind of see through the like illusion of all the details, and it's just they just realize that we're all one, and that you need to, they just have this implicit compassion, and realize that it's the mystical experience, the life review component that they experience, all these things simplify life in a way. Again, there's loads of all these challenges, but simplify them in a way that you don't necessarily have to invoke or subscribe to all these religious doctrines. It's a more kind of maybe a purer spiritual path, and so they'd be more attracted to spirituality, New Age,
like a kind of Gnostic experience.
Yeah, exactly. They're just living Gnostics, really. Yeah.
It reminds me of the idea of the divine dream, where in a lot of ancient cultures they had this idea that a dream required interpretation, or that you were going to be left these hints and clues. But then there was this purer sense of the dream, wherein you would have such a divine experience that would need no interpretation. You just utterly knew it was completely like a Gnostic experience of complete understanding of the divine situation, and therefore you didn't need all of the religious bits and bobs that go with these ideas often. So yeah, I totally understand that you would be like that. But like you say, for a lot of people, for example, who might hear voices and things like that, they might be a bit scared or worried about them, or there's probably going to be elements in NDEs that bring up a lot of questions for people as well. So often I imagine they do try to meet other people that have had near-death experiences as well.
Yeah, that's actually one thing that Bruce Grayson brings up in his recent book. Yeah, that as a psychiatrist, he tries to help as much as possible, and etc. But he found that developing the International Association of Near-Death Studies support groups was better than he or other professionals could do, because when they get together, there's suddenly this shared cosmology. It's like you've been there before, you've seen it. It's this consensual reality which is then emerges in their support group, and they cross notes, and it just feels everyone's experienced this, haven't they? When someone else a burden shared as a burden halved. Even if the burden is like wonderful, it's still burdensome because of the nature of
and the extra validation must feel fantastic for those people as well. If there's some element that was amazing to them that someone else says, I had the exact same thing, it must be fantastic.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Well, one of Mariam Abadi makes a point and says Jim McLennan has interviewed some underprivileged parts of society in NDEs and says that they're not all positive, and his stats are different regarding negative to positive NDEs from classical literature. That's quite an interesting one, isn't it? That reflects somehow in your life experiences and your life expectations.
Yeah, I mean, that is very interesting. I mean, I am really interested in different, subcultures, stratifications of society and culture, and how that reflects in the NDE, and especially, just the kind of bivalence of it, if it's a generally good, positive NDE or it's generally distressing, and why. But again, I think there's a level of the NDE which is so like insulting to the brain, like it just is so sort of eruptive that there is less opportunity for expectation effects. It's certainly very biographical and sort of personal, but I think it's less prone to expectation effects than psychedelic experiences, for instance, which are all about set and setting, and context basically drives the experience. But still saying that, you can't deny, as I'm trying to do, there is this. I mean, I think the NDE is an endogenous psychedelic experience, and so it will be prone to these the set of oneself. And so if you are from a very deprived background and you're experiencing real social defeat, and then that could well percolate into your NDE and become more distressing. I think, again, the circumstances of the NDE, it's quite interesting that these very distressing NDEs generally only happen in the kind of RDs, as you sort of termed them, like when you actually temporarily kind of clinically die. And so the distressing, I kind of lost my trail there, but the near-death experience can still be prone to one's set, and the Tibetans say this as well, the very moment of death. So that's what I was saying, the kind of circumstance of one's death can still influence maybe at least the initial stages of the dying process, and so that doesn't surprise me.
Interesting. Right, well, I'm aware that we've done our 2 hours. I am sure that there's going to be people out there who are going to be absolutely enthralled at the important work you're doing. How can people contact you, know more about your work? Do you have a website, or can you tell us about some articles that you've written or things that are coming up in the future?
I mean, it's good to go to, well, you can just email me at p.michael@greenwich.ac.uk. That's my university email, so I'd love to hear from anyone. In terms of, I have started to kind of put up a website, but I'm kind of waiting until I get a better collection of publications so I can put them all up there. I think emailing is probably just the best the best place, and I'm always happy to open up these dialogues more.
Excellent. Well, we can put your details on the website, on our feed as well. Well, anyway, Pascal, that was absolutely fascinating, really, really interesting. And as we were talking before we started the discussion, it's going to be interesting to see if we can get you and various other people together for an event. We'll all come down and stay at Sarah's and drive her mad and things like that down on the coast. So maybe this is something we should think about doing probably next year, because I think that would be really good. Right. Thanks everybody for listening in. Just to let you know that the next INCON will be on Monday, and our guest will be Vitaly Viteliev, who is an old friend of mine who had his period of fame. He was on Have I Got News for You a few years ago. And he was also, if you're of a certain age, you may remember the TV series Clive James on Television. And you may recall that he used to have what he called his Russian correspondent, where he'd go over to a guy that seemed to be in his attic of his house, describing what was going on in the Soviet Union. That was Vitaly. He's also a very, very amusing writer. His books on travel are to die for. They're just so funny. And he'll be joining us, so that's going to be really enjoyable. Again, thank you very much for Sarah in the background there as well. And thanks again to our guest, Pascal. It's been absolutely fascinating. So thanks, everybody, and best wishes, and we'll see you all on Monday. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Anthony and Sarah.
Okay, bye-bye. Bye.